Okay, I think we're ready now. So we're going to do a quick review over what we covered last week in regards to our sites and services, understanding subnets. I had a few questions, and then we're going to also cover the next part of the lab, which is working with users and groups, creating organizational units, and talk about how we're going to have these users access resources, and those resources are the files and folders on our servers. So we got a lot to cover today. So review real quick. Let's assume we have 3 locations. 1, 2, 3, and these servers all are connected through our WAN. And we have a server here, and server here. Okay, so this is Fenimore, Los Angeles, and New York City. Each location, how many networks do we have here? If we just take a look at this diagram, you can figure out how many we have. How many networks do we have? How many networks have I identified up here? 5. We have 1 here, 2 here, 3, 4, 5. Okay, the ones that we are primarily interested in are these right here. So let's say over here in New York City, this is the 172.16.10. The 24-bit mask, meaning the first 3 octets are identifying my subnet. This is the 172.16.11.0. 24-bit mask. And this one is the 172.16.12.0/24. Okay? So we have 3 subnets. And these right here, we'll say this is the 172.31.255.0 network. And this is the 172.31, just so we have a complete network drawn out here. We're all on the same page. All right. So the subnets that we are most interested in regards to Active Directory, understanding how to synchronize or how to replicate the Active Directory database that is sitting on every one of these servers. These servers, by the way, are domain controllers. So we need to replicate the information from Active Directory here over to Active Directory here. So this replication needs to occur. And we set this replication up by creating sites and services. So we have sites. So these are our sites. We have the FEN site, we have the LAS site, and we have the NYC site. And let me name my servers here. So this is domain controller 01, domain controller 02, domain controller 03. Just to get a very elaborate naming system. So now what we need to do is when we create these sites, we create the site, and inside the site we drag our server that exists in that particular physical site. We drag that server into that site called FEN. But now in order for the information to replicate from DC01 to DC02, which happens to be in the LAS site, we need to establish these links, this replication link. And we do that with subnets. So I create 3 subnets. I have the 172.16.12 subnet. I have the 172.16.11 subnet. And I have the 172.16.10 subnet. See where my subnets come from? They come from the actual IPs that are being used within the LAN that has my servers. So this server over here on DC3 has an IP address of 172.16.10.10. So 172.16.10 is the subnet. That subnet, 172.16.10, is going to be assigned to the NYC site. 172.16.11, hey, the 11 subnet happens to be physically configured in the LAS subnet. So this is going to be our Los Angeles, and then the FEN is the 172.16.12. So this is my FEN site. Any questions on this? Yes, sir.
Can you have a different subnet mask on there?
Yeah, you can have different subnet masks. Perfect. Let's try to do that. Let's say we add another site. What the heck, right? So let's add another site up here. Give me another location.
Denver.
Denver. We'll go DEN for the abbreviation for the site. The server, we'll call, it's our fourth domain controller, so we're going to call it DC04. And the subnet for Denver, since we just added it on late, this is the 172.31.253.0. And over here, we're going to have the 10.10. Actually, 10.10. Let's just do that. It's a big one. Denver's huge. 16-bit mask. Okay? So what we're going to have to do is go into Active Directory, Sites and Services. We have these three sites. We're going to have to create a fourth one. We create a site called Den for Denver. We then have to create a subnet, 10.10.0.0/16, and assign that to what site? Den. Boom. We just now have created the replication that's going to occur between DC1 and this one, and this one. So now DC4 can replicate to the other three domain controllers and keep the database of usernames, passwords, name changes, all up to date. Does this help?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So you'll have a few minutes today to clean that up if you need to. Are there any other questions in regards to sites and services? Yes, sir.
So that was step 1 through 3 we were supposed to do last.
Correct. Yep. Yep. So I'll come around and check that off. At the same time, I'm checking your usernames and passwords. We'll check that off. So what we're doing is we're applying the virtual, or more likely logical, Active Directory domain into a physical world that we have created. We've created this physical world. Now in our scenario, we only have one subnet, right? We only got our 3 servers existing in the one subnet that we designated. But I told you to create 2 more pretend ones. So create 2 more sites, and then make up 2 more subnets that we're not already using, because you can't have multiple. You can't have the same subnet as what's existing. And the easiest thing to do is to just rename the default site, right? The first one that's there that gets created is called the default first site. Just rename that to FEN. Create a brand new subnet, whatever your subnet scheme happens to be with whatever subnet mask you're using, and just assign it to that renamed default first site. And then create 2 more new ones. You're shaking your head. Did you have a question?
I gotta go back and just look over my thing and then probably ask you something, just to make sure.
Okay. Yeah, go take a look. But this is a fairly basic concept. There's nothing fancy here, and again, all this is doing is ensuring the replication is going to occur between servers. All of your servers in your particular scenario all happen to be in the same site, don't move your servers to different sites because they're not. Based on their IP address, they exist in the Fen site. That's where all your servers should exist. All your domain controllers should be in your Fen site. Don't move them to another site because their IP address, it'll mess up the link, and they won't replicate with each other like they're supposed to because they're on the same LAN. This is the same LAN right here. Question?
Yeah, I don't know if you're done up there. I just wanted to come glance at this and make sure
Yeah.
I have it right. Or I can look at somebody else's if it's right.
All your servers.
Okay, so what I was worried about was the fact that I didn't
No, don't create service
choose
two.
the default.
Service two is not a domain. It's not. It shouldn't be in there. Okay. You only have two subnets. Well, you have a /28. What is your?
I thought you could
Go
create
to
No, we're not creating it. This is an example of our physical world.
Yeah.
Your subnet is 10.10, the 16-bit mask.
Yeah, no, I know that.
But then why didn't you create that? No, you don't make up your own
So I
stuff.
was worried that.
This has to reflect the physical world.
Saying, but at 37, don't try to get something the same.
10.10
When I tried
is this subnet. Give me another subnet that's not the same. No, 1.1 is an IP. Give me a subnet. 10.10 dot 0.0 is the first subnet because I know that because if you look at the mask, so the first 16 bits, the first 2 octets identify my network. So what's another
So
network?
you'll use the last.
192.168 is 1.0 with a 24-bit mask. And then what's another one? No, you don't have to look. My subnets, one is 16, the other 3 have 24-bit mask. You have to match whatever you have in the real world. The other 2 are made
Yeah, that's
up.
what I was trying to
Make
do.
your own subnets. No, you can't do that because that is still part of this network. You see that? Okay, good. Oh, sorry. What's that? I don't know. Go to the command line. I config. Guys, your Fen site has to match the same subnet you physically have assigned to your router. I'm sorry, to your server. Go to your server, type ipconfig. Right there is your subnet. Look at your subnet mask. How many bits is it? 16 bits, 24 bits? And then put in the actual subnet ID. It has to physically match the real world. The only thing you can make up are the other 2 sites. You make up your own 2 subnets because they don't actually exist. We're just pretending they do, so you can go through the steps of creating multiple sites. Do you follow? Type ipconfig. Let me see. What is the mask? How many bits? The network mask. Well, 16. What do you have going on here? 24? No, and not a 10.10.3, just a 10.10.00.
We're doing.
I think we might need to do a subnet review. No, Aaron, I'm just. What's our masks?
Are we doing version 4 of 6?
You do both. Grant pointed out a cool thing. Are we doing IPv6 or IPv4? You can do both. Primarily, I just needed to see 4 to know that you can do it. But yeah, you can do both. In fact, thank you, Grant. That's a new requirement of this lab. Do IPv6 and IPv4 subnets because these servers could potentially communicate with each other over IPv6. In fact, what is the preferred protocol? IPv6. Done.
Can you check my?
So the subnet should match the exact subnet you have right now assigned to your physical servers.
Right, yeah. For IPv6 though, you would just use the IPv6
Slash 64.
Oh.
Whatever IPv6 number you got.
Okay. The first four?
The first one.
No.
Just, yeah, the first four.
Was it a subnet?
Sorry. Yes. The
That makes
first.
sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then if you were to make
The
a
first four colon slash 64.
Okay.
You got it. Because the other part is the host portion
Yeah.
of it. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, maybe.
Yep. So which one are you actually using for real? Go here. You're using the 8,000 for real. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. So that one should be assigned to whatever this server is a member of the site. Make sense?
Yep.
I'll make up one more subnet.
Just made up.
Yep. And then make up 2 IPv4s, and then one legit one, the one that is actually assigned to your server.
So I had 10.1.
No, go to your command line, ipconfig. What is your network? What part of that IP address identifies your network? Tell me, please, the number so I can understand that you understand. Huh? Perfect. That's your subnet. 16-bit mask.
Right.
So give me another subnet. Give me another subnet.
What do you, what part?
No, not. No, tell me another subnet number, another subnet ID. 10.10 is one network. Give me another one. No, that's part of the 10.10 network.
Yes. Okay, this got a little confusing. It was easy to
Guys,
do.
look real quick. Look real quick. Everyone is not applying your subnetting skills.
No.
Look, 10.10.1.10. If I assign that to a server, and it has a 16-bit mask, what does that mean? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1 or 8. What comes after 8? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Guess what? You cannot change this. This is my network. Okay? The rest of these are all 0. So now what is the very next network? It doesn't matter if I used a 1 here or 100 or 50. It's still part of the 1010 network, right? So what would give me the next one? 10.11 would be another perfect example. 10.9.
But I even say you can't change that.
Change what? You can't change this. But to get a different subnet, you have to change it.
Okay.
That's the part I don't think you understand. You have to use a different subnet.
Okay.
The 1010 is already being used
Well, that's what I was
for
getting confused,
for
because
this subnet.
If you saying that we can't change that, I'm thinking it's got to always be 1010. When you said what's another one, I'm thinking 1010.1.
Okay, so what I mean by you can't change it, meaning you've already used it.
It's already assigned.
You've already used it. So pick another one. Because you're saying, well, can I use 10.10.1? No, because any number between 0 and 255 is already part of the 1010 network.
Right.
So we have to change either the 10 or change the second 10.
So could you do 11.10?
You can, but guess what? 11.10 is assigned to a web server on the internet. And if you assign that to a computer inside your network, then none of your people in your company will ever be able to look at that website. Because why? Because they'll route to the internal IP address instead of out to the real one on the internet. You have to use 10 because 10 is a private IP. It's been reserved. Nothing on the internet uses 10. Nothing on the internet uses 172.16 all the way through 31. Nothing on the internet uses 192, 168, 0 through 255. Because those are what? Private IP ranges. Yeah. So 10.10 is already in use. So we have to use another one, right? We can't use the first 2 octets because our subnet mask tells us we can't. So to get a whole nother network, we just got to increment this number. 10.11. Or we can choose a whole nother different one. Guess what? 192.168.100.0/24. That's a whole nother subnet, right? Is that the same subnet as this subnet? No, completely different. Just like I did in here in this example. Does that help? Awesome. So fix that. Subnet. We good now? Ooh, look at that. So your real one is 8010, and that's what you have assigned to your physical servers. Then 8010, nice.
NYC. You and
1010, yep, and then the
Yeah, this,
803.
I made these ones match a little bit.
That's fine, but the 803 is what you did here physically.
Yep,
I
that's
see
right.
it right there.
Cool. Good show.
You good? Nice. You got the other one? Perfect. Got figured out? FE8. That's
You know how it's fried the other night?
the
Just fine.
public IPv6 addresses, which are called global unicast.
I did it threw me off too. I'm not gonna lie. It was simple.
Hey.
But
East.
so I think so anything.
1010, Isaac Benamore, 18,001, Isaac Benamore. The other two are just made up. Your global unicast address is 2001 4E0 That is a link local. You don't use link local. You communicate to other WANs, other sites. You have to use your global uni. So it's this one right here. It ends at the fourth extent. That's the third. And it's obviously McFarland Bond /16. No. What's their example? Only the first four hexbits. That's 4. 2, look at their example. 1 hexbit, 2 hexbit, 3 hexbit, 4 hexbit. 1, 2, 3, 4. Colon. You go. That's it. I don't like it. What, move your shoulder? Like that. Ah! This is your skill set. You getting this? Okay. No, I was helping you all that. Oh, good. I would get more creative than that, dude.
I did that.
HR, marketing, warehouse, IT. Come on, Department 1, 2, 3. How generic are we? What department are you? I'd like a secret U.S. government. Department 52.
I'm gonna change it to all area 51.
Department 51. Nice. All right, I think we're all just about there. Can I erase this? Awesome. It's crazy how stuff we learned last semester is getting applied this semester in this class. And all the stuff we've learned in previous classes, we're starting to apply it now and have to recall it. Isn't that nuts? I'll take a look. Give me a second.
Well, as a rate of 10 miles. As long as you can stop the gas station along the way. Sorry, up inside.
Why did
you create those? This one where you can
inside of Domingo Jones?
So those are right around my. Inside those sites.
Advanced. Okay, see what I did? It's not down here. Domain controllers is a built-in OU designed for domain controllers.
Come to the wrong person.
Not for other OUs. Organization unit is just a way to organize your compass. put
there
it
we
directly
go, yeah.
underneath. So the way you have it set up is you have a user called Bob in the LA OU, part of the domain controllers OU, part of my domain. That doesn't make sense. Domain controllers are for domain controllers. Those are servers, not other weird objects like users and groups.
Alright, so again, you have it set up for that. The first number is 101000. With subnet mask
Oh, you're just
who do you think? Men walking bikes over here. I don't know.
sorry.
Okay, the next part of class, so you guys can get moving on with your next topic. Who has the actual assignment pulled up?
Okay, so this is a big one. And then dash what? How many of these bits are actually? How many? It's 1010, but okay. Think of each of those.
I should probably just move that into a different. It's a lot of stuff. I should move that to a different assignment. Okay, so the next assignment is gets involved. It's creating a shared folder, sharing that folder, so a particular set of users can access the resources within that shared folder. So before we get into understanding shared folders, we need to understand how Active Directory and Microsoft want you to be able to organize your users and groups. You might think if we just have a user called Bob and we want Bob to access this folder, we just say, hey Bob, you now have permission to see this folder, right? Seems easy enough. What if we have 500 Bobs and 1,000 Susies? That gets kind of complicated clicking through and selecting the particular Susies and the particular Bobs that need access to this folder and these other Bobs and Susies that have access to this folder. It gets crazy to maintain. So you're going to want to create groups to organize these users. And then instead of just saying, okay, now this group gets access to this folder and this group gets access to another folder, that gets kind of complicated as well because then our groups don't always match the physical resources, right? We don't have an HR firewall or an HR folder. HR should be accessing the human resources folder for their content, but they also are working on a project with customer service to hire customer service reps, so they should have access to another folder that have resources there. So trying to decide and figure out, okay, what is it that HR needs access to? I can't remember that. But if I create a local group based on the resource that is stored there, all I have to do is create a user for HR, put them in the HR global group, and they instantly have access to all the resources they need. That's what we're essentially setting up. And it seems kind of like you're doing a lot of extra steps now because you're just doing it all in one fell swoop. But imagine a month from now having to add these few more users and give them access to everything they need to be in HR. Do you remember all the resources that HR needed? No, you did that a month ago. You've already moved on to 10 other projects since then. So if you can just simply create an HR user, throw them in the HR group, boom, hands up, you're done. Right? Now they have access to all these resources that you already established and set up a month ago that you don't have to try to remember anymore. So this acronym is what Microsoft uses to identify how we organize these resources. So first resource is account. This is our user. This is Bob. Bob wants to have access to this resource, this folder. We're going to call it HR. And this HR folder is accessible on server 1. So to access this resource, Bob is going to type in / server1 dot domain.org, or whatever domain we have, /HR. That's the UNC path that Bob is going to access HR in this example. So how do we get Bob now to access this resource? The first thing we need to do is add Bob to this three-headed monster called a global group. So Bob needs to be added to this global group. AG. So this global group we're going to call HR. Now that Bob is a member of HR, we can now organize all the other HR people inside of the global group called HR. So this global group doesn't have access to this resource. So what we need to do is we need to create a domain local group or a special group that is specifically assigned for what type of access needs to be given to this HR folder. So we're going to create, not create it there, I'm going to create it here. We're going to create a local group here, and we're going to call this local group HR full. Meaning, in this naming scheme, HR folder on my local computer with full access. In other words, they can change and delete files and folders inside there. Make sense? Okay, that's our local group. And then that local group is going to be given, when I edit the properties of the HR folder, read, write, and execute permissions. And again, I'm just using these basic permissions. There's a lot more permissions in Windows. In fact, maybe the better way to do this is to say modify permissions. So that's using Microsoft's language. Okay, so they can modify anything inside of the HR folder. Make sense? So now what we do is we put the HR group inside of the local group, and now the inheritance happens to where Bob now has modified permissions to the files inside this HR folder. Pretty simple, right? Cool. Now remember when we took a server and we promoted it to a domain controller, and I said that the local administrator, what happens to that local administrator? Any local users that exist on that server.
If you turn it into
a domain controller. In other words, it became an Active Directory server, an Active Directory domain controller.
they become domain admins.
Remember I used the Star Trek analogy? They become assimilated into the board. They become part, like they become, like the local identity of that server disappears. Because it is now part of the collective, it's part of the domain. You follow me? So there are no local users or groups for that particular server. They get hidden away. Because it now is Active Directory. You follow me here? Anybody not quite with me? Like, what are you talking about here? Anyone? Brandon? Okay. Dan? Okay.
I'm following you.
You're just waiting for the next thing I'm going to throw at you?
See what you say next, and then
Okay.
I'll see if I have a question.
Let's say that we have another server called DC01, and on that server we have an HR1 folder. And we want the people in HR to have access to that. but we also want people in administration to have read-only access to it. Ooh, now we're getting complicated. So first, let's focus on the first thing. We want any HR person globally, any HR person, to have access to this HR folder on DC01. DC01 is part of the domain now, right? It doesn't have any local users or local groups. So there is a group called, and I'm going to put it right next to it, called a domain local group. And we're going to call this domain local group HR full. Same name. It's okay, because this is done on the server, but this is done within the domain. And we're going to put the global group HR inside of this domain local group. And then give this domain local group change permissions to the HR1 folder. Actually, I should probably call this HR1, shouldn't I? Because there might be an HR2 or HR, so get descriptive, Aaron. Get descriptive. HR1 full. Or you can do HR1 change, whatever you want to use for naming scheme. All right, so here's my other scenario, right? We have admin. Give me a name. Steve, who's in administration. So we created a global group called admin. So Steve is a member of the admins group. That's called admins with an S. There we go. So Steve is a member of the admins group. And HR, the HR director says, well, we don't really trust the admins, but they kind of want to see what we're doing in HR, so let's just give them read access to our files so they don't accidentally delete something, because, yeah, Steve is kind of like trigger happy with the delete key all the time. So in IT, you're like, I can accommodate that, sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another group called HR1 read. My three-headed monster. Okay, this is a domain local group, and I'm now going to give the HR read access to the HR1 folder and put the global group inside of the domain local group called HR1 read. So now if Steve logs in, Steve inherits the permissions of any group membership that admins is part of. Admins happens to be part of the HR1 read group. Okay? And now they have access to HR1 read. Okay, we can even get more confusing. And we can create a group called HR what is it when you're like a contractor, right? Or a temp hire? HR contractor. Let's go with HR contractor. So an HR contractor group. And we have another user called Sally. Sally is an HR contractor. We're hiring her for the next 2 months to work on a new project for our warehouse and getting everyone forklift certified and blah, blah, blah. So she needs to see our policies and stuff for HR. So we're going to put Sally in our HR contractor group, which the HR contractor group has been given, or is a member of the HR1 read group. So now guess what? This was already been set up, so now I just got to give Sally access to it. In fact, you can also take this domain local group and give them read access. I'm going to draw my arrow, pointing right thing, right there. So if we do this, what kind of permissions do I get? If I make the HR read group a member of the HR full local group over here, what are they going to have access to? They're going to be able to modify or change the HR folder on this server, right? Okay. But what I could do is, okay, so this one they will have change or modify. It's the same thing. Or I could do this and give them read. So I can take a domain local group and assign it specific permissions outside of this local group, give it read access to the HR group. So now Sally gets hired on, and we hire on. Sally's like, well, I can't do this by myself. I'm going to need Tammy. And there you go. Okay, well, Tammy comes on the following week, and now we create a user called Tammy. We put Tammy in the HR controller, HR contractor group. Contract. I can't spell contractor. Okay, the HR contractor group. And now, did I have to change any special privileges for Tammy? Tammy was hired on. I created a user called Tammy, put Tammy in the HR contractor group because she's an HR contractor. Guess what? Tammy now has access to everything she needs. She can get stuff off of this server. She can get stuff off of this server. Right? You don't want to do both. It's this one or this one. Make sure you identify this. Or. Okay, one or the other. Okay, you don't want to do both. If you do both, this is a good little quiz. What permissions are in place?
Modify.
The highest. The most access is given. Or if it's restrictive, then the most restrictive access is given. In other words, if you deny access. So there is a way that you can deny access. So there could be a way. So if the domain local group here had deny, then if you're a member of this group, there's no way that you're going to be able to change anything. Even if these guys have change permissions, deny always gets precedence.
You won't even see the permissions.
I don't even use deny. It just gets really weird. I've never used deny. I've never seen it used. And in places I have seen it used, funky things happen. So just give permission or don't give it at all. It's either they have read access or they have modify access. Don't use the deny. The deny overrides everything. So accounts get added to global groups. That's how we get them organized. Accounts exist where? In Active Directory, right? Accounts exist globally. Global groups is how we organize those global users. Where are the resources that we're trying to access? On the local server. So we're then going to have domain local or just plain local groups. They're going to have permissions to these resources. But if it's an Active Directory domain controller, there is no local group, so we create a domain local group. So accounts go into global groups get added to domain local groups get assigned permissions to resources. AGLP or AGDLP. You can skip this whole local group concept if you want to, but that's just how fine you want to deal with it. Domain local is as local as you need to get. If the server is a member of the domain, a domain local group is sufficient. This is important to organize it like this, especially if you have users accessing resources on different domains. Because you cannot take a group called HR contractors and give them access to a local resource in a different, you can't take a domain local group and give it access to a different domain. They have to be global groups in order to be able to do that.
What's the L and the P stand for?
There is no LP, it's DL.
Oh, domain.
Domain local.
Low.
So
And what's the P stand for?
permissions.
Okay.
Accounts get added to global groups. Those get added to domain local groups, which get added permissions to a resource. So accounts, global groups go into local groups get assigned permissions.
An account is. Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to think of it. We can go on.
That's it. So take a break, and we'll come back, and I'll show you what it looks like in person.
Yeah, their server transfer is screwing up because ownership, the person who created